First of all, thank you for all of you for coming here and attending the public lecture. So today our guest lecturer is the professor of economics from Missouri University. He has written 5 books and more than 30 articles. So his work is concentrated on the issues of entrepreneurship, innovation, regulations. So today he will present the topic about entrepreneurship and its role in economic development. So I'm sure you will enjoy the lecture, and so let's meet Peter Klein.
This is what we call technical difficulties. Here we go. I'm going to stand over here, if it's okay, and I will try not to move too much for the benefit of the cameraman. But thank you very much, Lasha, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming to attend the lecture. It's been a great pleasure for me to be here and to visit your country, to see some old friends and to meet some new ones. Now, in a sense, coming here has been a little bit nostalgic, and indeed a little bit of a homecoming for me, because believe it or not, I used to live in Georgia for 7 years. The other Georgia. Most people in the United States are aware of this one, but they don't know quite as much about the real Georgia. And when I get home, I'm going to explain to people. I will tell them how wonderful it is, and encourage them to come and visit and bring their tourist dollars and good things like that. But I was asked to speak tonight on entrepreneurship and economic development. Obviously, economic development is something that is extremely important in many parts of the world, particularly in countries like Georgia. Transition economies that are experiencing a lot of change institutionally, changes in market conditions, changes in people's behavior, and many of us from outside would characterize Georgia as a very entrepreneurial country. Now, is entrepreneurship critical to economic performance? Is it the key to economic development, not only for countries like Georgia, but for countries around the world where economic development is even more important than it is here? Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of the Indian subcontinent, and other places that have extreme poverty and for which economic development is desperately needed. Now, if you are like students at my university, some of you may have to leave before the lecture is over. 1 or 2 of you may fall asleep or otherwise be distracted toward the end, so I thought I would go ahead and answer the question now, just in case you don't stay till the very end. Is entrepreneurship key to economic development? The answer is yes and no. In other words, yes, there are some features of entrepreneurship, some ways to think about entrepreneurship in which we might say it is essential for economic performance, but other ways in which we might say, well, maybe this isn't so important. This is a very classic economist answer to important questions. The US President Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s was quoted as saying he wanted to have a one-handed economist as his economic advisor, so the advisor couldn't say, when he asked him a question, well, on the one hand, but on the other hand. So economists are well known for not giving very straightforward and clear answers, and I'm not going to buck the trend tonight. No, I'll try to give you a little bit more background and context. In the remainder of our discussion, I'll try to explain why I think this is not an easy question to answer, and why maybe the best answer we can give is yes and no. Now, entrepreneurship, as is well known to many of you, has become really a hot topic at universities, among policymakers, in the media, among business practitioners, and so forth. I sometimes refer to an entrepreneurship phenomenon, meaning a huge surge of interest in entrepreneurship, in things related to entrepreneurship. What is the evidence of that? Well, at universities, in business schools, there has been a huge increase in the number of courses in entrepreneurship. I know here at the Free University, you can take courses in entrepreneurship. Many schools around the world, colleges and universities, you can major in entrepreneurship. You can attend many lectures, go to many programs, read many articles, read many books on entrepreneurship. There's a whole academic subfield of entrepreneurship with journals, scholarly journals, and articles, that have the usual impenetrable mathematics and statistics, so most people cannot understand what the article is saying, right? But it looks very scientific because it has a lot of math in it and a lot of numbers. So entrepreneurship has all of the features of other scientific research fields. There are organizations, centers, institutes devoted to the study of entrepreneurship. Most of the major American universities have an entrepreneurship center or an entrepreneurship institute. Here's the logos of just a few of them that I just downloaded from the web. Stanford University has something called Center for Entrepreneurial Studies. The University of Illinois has an entrepreneurship center. Here's the Legatum Center at MIT, which is one of the largest centers devoted to entrepreneurship. There is funding, not only public funding, but private funding for research and activity in entrepreneurship. The Kauffman Foundation is an American foundation located in Kansas City, not far from where I live, gives out millions of dollars to scholars and also to entrepreneurship practitioners to understand entrepreneurship, to study entrepreneurship. In some of the lectures earlier today, we were discussing the problem of measuring entrepreneurial activity. And the Kauffman Foundation every year puts out a publication with an index. They rank different US states and also different countries in terms of the level of entrepreneurship activity. There's even a Nobel Prize given for entrepreneurship. How many people know who this is? Anybody know who this gentleman is? Yeah, good guess. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, I think it was 2008. His name is Muhammad Yunus. He is an economist by training. He's a native of Bangladesh, and he is famous for setting up a very large microfinance, microcredit institution. It's called the Grameen Bank. Many of you heard of the Grameen Bank? It's located in Bangladesh. The Grameen Bank specializes in giving very, very small loans, what they call microloans or microcredit. 20 US dollars to a peasant in Bangladesh. Most of the Grameen Bank borrowers are women, and the women take the $20 and they use it to buy one cow. And they milk the cow and they sell the milk for profit. So Yunus set up an organization that specializes in making these very, very small loans and has received a lot of attention because the thinking is, the World Bank and the IMF and NGOs have not done a very good job in countries like Bangladesh improving the standard of living. And that maybe instead of getting, big funding and grants from international aid agencies, maybe what countries like Bangladesh need is more entrepreneurship at a starting at a very, very small scale. Why would that warrant a Nobel Peace Prize? Well, the theory is, or what the Nobel Prize Committee explained, was that in many parts of the world, like on the Indian subcontinent, a lot of conflict, war, violence is driven by poverty. And then if you can find some way to bring very, very poor countries out of poverty and into a better set of economic conditions, that will lead to less violence, less conflict, less war. Okay, I've told you sort of things kind of about entrepreneurship. things that relate to entrepreneurship. But I haven't told you what entrepreneurship is. What is entrepreneurship? Now, of course, I'm lecturing in English. My Georgian is fluent, but I just chose to lecture in English just for fun, just for practice. In English, the word entrepreneur has a certain meaning. I don't know it so much in Georgian. In some other languages, it doesn't have the same meaning. For example, in Spanish, the word that is used for entrepreneur is the same word that is used for businessman. So anybody in business is an entrepreneur. In English, entrepreneur means something a little different. It's not just any businessman or businesswoman. It means something special, and it usually has a very positive connotation. To call someone an entrepreneur is a compliment. To say that Lasha here is a very entrepreneurial teacher at the university means that's a good thing. He brings in outside speakers, and he arranges events, and he does all kinds of wonderful, innovative things. He's so entrepreneurial. That would be a great compliment to give to someone. So when I ask my students at home, you know, the kind of a word game, if I say entrepreneur, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Well, a lot of people think technology, right? Who knows who this guy is?
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates. Everybody knows Bill Gates. This is an old picture of Bill Gates when he looked more nerdy than he does now. You know, when you have billions and billions of dollars, you tend to look less nerdy than when you're just starting out. But that's Bill Gates and his partner, a guy named Paul Allen. They were the co-founders of Microsoft. And so we think of people like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or the guys who founded Google. How many of you have seen the movie about Google, the social network? Have any of you seen that movie? So I'm sorry, Facebook, excuse me. The guys who founded Facebook, the ones who founded Google would also be examples, right? These are often the kinds of things that come to mind. Sometimes, when we say the word entrepreneur, we think of great inventors. That is Thomas Edison, the famous American inventor who invented the light bulb and the phonographic record and many, many other inventions. Or we think of great industrialists. That's John D. Rockefeller. Somebody said Ford. I mean, Henry Ford would be another example, right? A great business person who created a new industry, who started something that became a very large company, and so on. Sometimes we think of actually companies, right? We don't think of people. We think of Google or Apple or even, I don't know if any of you know 3M. 3M is a less glamorous and sexy kind of company. It's an industrial company based in Minnesota that is known for being extremely innovative. And the research employees at 3M, there's a famous policy that they're allowed 1 day per week to do whatever they want, in terms of doing sort of research and experiments and so on. And they've come up with some very major innovations. Does anyone know what's the most famous innovation coming from 3M? In English, we call it the Post-it note. How can I explain what a Post-it note is? You know those a little yellow square? You write a note on it, you stick it on a piece of paper, and then you pull it right off? I don't know what you call it. Yeah, sticky note. The glue for the sticky note, I mean, that's a special kind of glue. It sticks when you want it to, but it comes off when you want to take it off, and it doesn't leave any residue behind. It seems like an obvious thing now, but until this sticky note was developed by 3M, no one had thought of that idea before. So sometimes we think, entrepreneurship, that means companies like this. Some people use the word to describe entire societies. There's a famous entrepreneurship researcher named David Aldrich, who teaches in Germany and in the US, has written many books and articles on entrepreneurship. One of his recent books is called The Entrepreneurial Society. And he says what an economy, what a community really wants is to be entrepreneurial. So here, the term entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial in this case, is being applied not to a person, not to a company, but to an entire society. So what does it mean for a society to be entrepreneurial? Some of the authors at the, researchers at the Kauffman Foundation that I mentioned before published a book about 2 years ago called Good Capitalism, Bad Capitalism. A book about different kinds of national economies. And they argued that there are two forms of capitalism. There is entrepreneurial capitalism, that's the good kind, and there's what you might call bureaucratic capitalism, or politicized capitalism, and that's the bad kind. So here they're saying that even an abstract concept like capitalism can be described as being entrepreneurial or not. So there are many ways that people talk about entrepreneurs, talk about entrepreneurship, talk about being entrepreneurial, and it isn't always clear what exactly that term means. If you really want to know, I suggest that you consult two outstanding books that are written on the nature of entrepreneurship by some brilliant authors, and you can get one book is called The Capitalist and the Entrepreneur, published in 2010. One is called Organizing Entrepreneurial Judgement, which is being published right now, any day now. It will be available in the bookstore. You can pre-order it at Amazon or the bookstore of your choice. And actually this book, The Capitalist and the Entrepreneur, I can guarantee that it will be worth your investment to get a copy of that book because you can get it for free, okay? You can download the entire thing as a PDF for free at the publisher's website, the Mises Institute. I guess I can't guarantee it because there's still the cost of your time to download. You might still decide it's not worth even that. But it's a very low cost to get. And in these books, among other things, I discuss the literature on entrepreneurship, and I provide my own suggestions for how we might think about entrepreneurship in a way that's more clear, more straightforward, and more clear. So let me tell you a little bit about this framework now. How should we think about entrepreneurship? Well, as I read the literature, as I talk to scholars and others who specialize in entrepreneurship, I see sort of basically two different ways of characterizing entrepreneurship. Two different ways of thinking about it. The first is what I would call entrepreneurship as an outcome or a phenomenon. I call that the usual perspective in the modern entrepreneurship literature. So entrepreneurship is something that you can see, that you can count, that you can measure, right? For example, self-employment, right? So much of the literature describes, entrepreneurs are people who work for themselves, and non-entrepreneurs are people who work for somebody else. Okay, so if you are a self-employed businessman or businesswoman, you are an entrepreneur. Now, the good thing about self-employment is that we tend to have pretty good data on it. I don't know how it works in Georgia, but in the US, on your tax forms, some of your official government forms, and on the census forms, they ask you a number of questions, and one of the questions they ask is, what is your occupation? What is your job? And there's a box, doctor, lawyer, teacher, truck driver, entrepreneur. They just mean self-employed, you work for yourself, okay? Maybe it's a kind of firm or a kind of industry like small firms. So maybe small firms are entrepreneurial and large firms are not. Or young firms, new firms, high growth firms are entrepreneurial. And big firms, old firms, slow growth firms are not. Now, another advantage of thinking about entrepreneurship as an outcome or phenomenon is not only can we measure it, but we, especially those of us who teach, we can teach it. Right? We can teach about small business. We can teach about creating new companies. I mean, do you have the Dummies books in Georgia? Do you know this series of books? Okay, so there's a whole series of books that I guess they're published in the US, but they're available in many countries in different languages. You know, the Dummies books. You know, this means making it very, very easy. There's like, you know, cooking for dummies and parenting for dummies, you know, poker for dummies, basketball for dummies, whatever. Right? These are supposed to be very, you know, easy to use, step-by-step instructions for how to do something. In fact, for Christmas, I bought my wife a banjo. Do you know what a banjo is? Kind of like a guitar. It's a little round thing. She always wanted to learn the banjo, but she never played. So I went online, and at Amazon you could order a banjo and banjo for dummies together, you know, at a reduced price. So I got her the banjo and the book Banjo for Dummies. And there are plenty of books on entrepreneurship for dummies. Okay? Now, nothing wrong with this perspective. However, if you do a lot of reading of the classic books on entrepreneurship theory, the great contributions to our understanding of entrepreneurship and why it matters, why it's important, these authors tend not to describe entrepreneurship as an outcome or phenomenon, but rather as a way of thinking or a way of acting. A fundamental aspect of human behavior. For example, things like creativity, boldness, imagination. One famous entrepreneurship theorist named Israel Kirzner characterized entrepreneurship as alertness to profit opportunities. So there are opportunities in the market to make money, but not everyone is able to recognize those opportunities. Some people are more alert than others to finding these opportunities, these gaps in the market. And entrepreneurship is the faculty of recognizing, of discovering, of being alert to opportunities for gain. Another very famous economist named Joseph Schumpeter defined entrepreneurship as innovation in the broadest sense, right? Not just inventing things like Thomas Edison, but new ways of doing business, new ways of organizing things, new ways of selling, and so forth. I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about the idea often associated with Frank Knight and also Ludwig von Mises, entrepreneurship as judgment under uncertainty. A particular kind of decision-making that we all engage in under conditions, you know, in an uncertain world. You know, notice some differences between the second perspective and the first. One is very hard to measure. Where do we go to get data on alertness? How many people are alert? How alert are they, right? What's the alertness rate in Georgia compared to the alertness rate in China or the alertness rate in Russia or whatever? Okay, where do we go to get that data? How would we count that? How much judgmental decision making is going on? It's not at all clear how you would measure that, and it's also not very clear how we would teach that. So if you take a course in entrepreneurship, have any of you students taken a course here at the university in entrepreneurship? Has anyone taken that course? You have an opportunity to take those courses here. I haven't looked at the course syllabus to know what the assignments, but if it's like other courses, most entrepreneurship courses in the United States teach this. How to write a business plan, how to do basic marketing, how to get funding, small business management, those kinds of skills. We really don't know how to teach creativity, boldness, imagination, alertness, discovery, judgment, and so forth. We think these are positive attributes, right? We want people to be this way, but we don't know exactly how to make them this way or how to find out how to measure whether they really are acting this way. I'm sorry? People are born this way. Right. So her statement is people are born this way. So one approach to this problem is to say, well, these kinds of skills aren't teachable. Some people are just born with them, and other people aren't. It's not exactly clear how we could demonstrate that by research either. We can give people personality tests. We can ask them questions and try to find out whether they act this way or not. But even so, I mean, am I a creative person? I mean, thank you very much. I mean, I sort of think I am. You know, you could say, well, his slides are prettier than some other professor's slides. Fine, but you know, am I as creative as Woody Allen? Am I as creative as who's a famous, you know, as Pablo Picasso? Am I as creative as your favorite music, you know, your favorite pop singer? I don't know. I'm not creative compared to them, or not in that way. So even if you asked, whatever I have, is it born or is it learned? It's not even clear exactly what I have. Now, another thing that's interesting about this is, you know, if entrepreneurship is a way of thinking or acting, it doesn't only take place in certain kinds of firms or certain kinds of occupations, right? Can self-employed people be creative? Can they be alert? Can they exercise good judgment? Well, of course they can. It's very important that they do. Can people who are employees working for companies, can they exercise good judgment? Sure. Can they be creative? Of course they can. Can they be alert to opportunities to improve the performance of the company? Yeah, I mean, managers hope that their employees will be alert to those opportunities and will look for ways to exploit them. So it isn't clear how these things map into these. Right? And in fact, we often describe these kind of traits in contexts that have nothing to do with business at all. I used this example with the students the other day, but I have a teenage son, and like most teenage boys, all he wants to do is eat. Right? He eats all the time. He's always hungry. You know, you don't know where they're not fat, but he just always eats. And so many times he will come to me, you know, at night and say, I'm hungry. There's nothing to eat in the house. There's nothing for me to eat. And of course the house is filled with food. He means he's too lazy to do, he wants me to make him a sandwich or whatever. And I'll say, hey, be a little entrepreneurial about it, please. Will you please be entrepreneurial? What I mean is, go look in the kitchen and find something. You figure it out. Find something to eat that you can make yourself. Don't bother me, leave me alone. Okay? When I say to my teenager, please go be entrepreneurial, I don't mean go start a company tonight. Right? I just mean show some initiative. Think on your feet. Put a little effort into it. Okay, so if those are the kinds of things we mean by entrepreneurship, then why are we so interested in this? Maybe because we can measure. Maybe because we can teach. And we tend to focus on things that we can measure and that we can teach, even though that may not always be the right thing to do. Let me talk a little bit about this notion of entrepreneurial judgment, because I want to refer to it in a couple of applications in just a moment. Judgment is often associated with a famous economist named Frank Knight. And Frank Knight wrote a famous book in the 1920s called Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. And some of you may have heard of this guy before, or have heard of this idea even without his name. If you've ever heard of people distinguishing between risk and uncertainty. I don't know if in Georgian, if you use the same word for what in English we call risk and uncertainty. Or do you use a different word?
Risk.
Yeah. Okay. So what Frank Knight meant was that he said, look, there are a lot of circumstances when we don't know what will happen tomorrow. Right? We don't know about the future. So if I go to the casino and I play a game with dice, right? You roll the dice. I don't know what numbers will come up. Okay, but, you know, if there's a, you know, one of these little die, one of those things, you know, if it has 6 sides and there's one number on each side and it's not, you know, it hasn't been it's a fair die, then if I throw it, I know the probability that any particular number will come up is, thank you math majors, 1/6, right? The probability is 1/6 that any particular number will come up. I don't know which number will come up, but it's a very well specified problem, right? I know that there are 6 possible outcomes, and I know that the probability of each is 1/6, and I can, come up with some sort of a model of how much I should be willing to bet and what I should do in those kinds of circumstances. Have any of you taken a course in decision theory? Sometimes they draw these little diagrams like a tree, where, okay, here I am, if I go this way, this will happen to me with probability 0.3. If I go this way, something else will happen to me with probability 0.5. What should I do? Well, I just, I take the value of each outcome and I multiply by the probabilities and I come up with expected values. Some of you are nodding. You know this kind of analysis. If we can characterize a situation where we don't know what's going to happen in the future in that way, then any rational person who has access to the same information would reach the same decision. Right? Anybody can follow the rule and come up with the same behavior. Now, Professor Knight said there are many situations in life where we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we cannot express the problem, using formal decision theory. Tomorrow, will I meet the woman I love? I'm already married, but hypothetically, right? If I'm single, what is the probability that tomorrow I will meet the love of my life? I mean, it's not obvious that you can parameterize that problem the way you can with gambling, right? I mean, now you could say, okay, well, there's 2 possible outcomes, yes or no. But what's the probability? How would you come up with a number to say, well, 63% is the probability that I will meet my one and true soulmate tomorrow? Or, what's going to happen to me when I go home tonight? I mean, there's a lot of things that can happen to you, right? Hopefully you walk home, or you drive home, or you take the bus or whatever, and you go home and everything's fine and you have a nice dinner or whatever. But, you could be in an accident on the way home. I hope that won't happen to any of you. If you're old like me, you could have a heart attack on the way home. It could start raining, I could get wet, I could get robbed by somebody. Maybe I go home and my house got robbed, or my house is on fire, or, there's any number of things that could happen to me on the way home. Some of them I can't even think of, right? Some of them may be very, very unlikely, so unlikely that I don't even think of them, right? I'm guessing that when you walk home tonight, if you're walking home through maybe an area, a neighborhood that's not very safe, you might behave in a different way, right? You be more cautious, maybe you walk a little faster, you're really looking around to check your surroundings, you take some precaution. But how many of you, when you walk home today, will be thinking, okay, if there's an alien invasion right now, what will I do? Should I run? Should I fight them? Should I let them abduct me and do experiments on me? Probably you're not thinking about that, because in your mind that is not going to happen. That's not even a possibility. And there are plenty of things that could happen to you tonight that you can't even name. If I asked you to take a piece of paper and write down every single thing that could happen to you before you go to bed tonight, you couldn't do it. What about for business? What's the probability that my business will succeed? What's the likelihood that I will enjoy my work? Will this entrepreneurial venture, lead to the outcomes that I want? According to Knight, those are not situations where we have well-defined risk distributions, right? So uncertainty is where we do not know what's going to happen. We cannot describe it using math or a formula. Now, Knight didn't, so what then do people do? What do you do in those cases? Well, Knight argued that people do have a way of handling uncertainty. They exercise what he called judgment, right? Judgment is making decisions in conditions where it's not risk, but it's uncertainty. We don't just guess. Our behavior is not completely random, but also we cannot specify it in a formal decision rule. If you like, you could think of it as intuition. You know the idea of intuition? I just kind of have a feeling that it's going to be a certain way. I can't explain why I know that. Over the centuries, many men and women have gotten into fierce arguments because the man says, well, how do you know that? Can you prove that? And the woman says, it's woman's intuition. Okay. So judgment, according to Mr. Knight, there he is, represents decision-making under uncertainty. And in this perspective, the primary entrepreneurial act is not discovery of something. It's not recognizing something that was already there and grabbing it. Rather, it's investing your time, your reputation, and some real valuable assets, money, tools, equipment, land, in anticipation of some uncertain reward. Right? So there's a sense in which each of you in this room tonight is an entrepreneur. Why? Well, why did you come to the lecture? Because I had to. No, I mean, assuming you weren't forced to. I'm sorry, somebody was...
We hoped it would be interesting.
Okay, you hoped it would be interesting. You hoped you would learn something. You hoped that I would sing a few songs and entertain you a little bit, right? That's not going to happen. Did you have to invest anything in coming here? I mean, I didn't notice anyone at the back door collecting money. So you didn't have to pay a fee to come here, but did you have to invest something? Of course you did. Your time. Right, there's an opportunity cost, right? You could be doing something else. You gave up something else to come here. Now, hopefully, right, my hope is that at the conclusion of the lecture, you know, of course, first you'll all stand up and cheer, like at a football game, right? And you'll walk out and you'll say, wow, that was so great. I just gained so much valuable knowledge from that lecture. I'm so glad that I came. However, it's possible, unlikely, but possible. I've been doing this long enough that maybe one or two of you will walk out of here saying, that was the biggest waste of time ever. That was awful. I wish I had just stayed home and, you know, watched TV. It would have been a much better use of my time. Right? So each of you made an investment in coming here, your time. And maybe, I don't know if some of you weren't here on campus already. Maybe you had to ride the bus or pay a taxi. Maybe you actually did have to pay some transportation costs to come. You did it because you anticipated that the benefits you would receive would be greater than the costs you had to pay. If you're right, then you walk home happy, except for the aliens, right? You walk home thinking, yeah, I earned a profit. It's not a money profit, but it's a mental profit, a subjective profit. If you're unhappy with the lecture, you go home angry. You say that was a loss, right? So profit and loss can make sense even outside of a money context. Now, it may be hard to measure those profits and losses with numbers if they're purely mental, purely cognitive. But at least we can understand that notion of profit and loss. Now, if we're studying entrepreneurship, the kind of entrepreneurship of you coming here to the lecture or not, maybe that isn't all that important for understanding why an economy grows or, what's GDP, whatever. We might be particularly interested in a kind of investment under uncertainty that is made by people like Bill Gates and, Steve Jobs and so on. People who invest serious amounts of financial and physical capital, producing goods and services that they hope to sell on the market and hoping to earn profit that is monetary. Right? Those are the entrepreneurs who move markets. You and I are entrepreneurs every day, but in a much less important sense. Okay? Now, Mr. Knight says that judgment cannot be hired, but is exercised through resource ownership. Judgment cannot be hired, but is exercised through resource ownership. He says the following in his book: "The only risk which leads to a profit is a unique uncertainty resulting from an exercise of ultimate responsibility, which in its very nature cannot be insured, nor capitalized, nor salaried. Profit arises out of the inherent absolute unpredictability of things." Right, so when he refers to the inherent absolute unpredictability of things, he's referring to uncertainty, or what people now often call Knightian uncertainty. But notice also he says, he refers to an exercise of ultimate responsibility, which in its very nature cannot be insured, nor capitalized, nor salaried. What he means is, judgment is not the same thing as expressing an opinion. Judgment is not the same thing as having an idea. Right? Does anybody have an iPad in front of them? Anybody using their iPad right now? It's okay. Yeah, hold it up. Yeah. Right? So I could have said, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, whatever it was, I could have said, boy, I bet if I made a little computer that doesn't have a keyboard and you can write on it with your finger, I bet I could make a lot of money doing that. A tablet, I don't know what you call it here, we call it tablet computers. That's the general category. And the iPad is the most popular tablet computer. I might have said that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but if I just say that and then I go home, nothing happens, right? I don't produce anything. I don't invest any resources in anything. It's just talk, right? So entrepreneurship in this understanding does not take place until resources have been invested. Merely talking about something is not the same thing as doing something. So, in other words, Steve Jobs could have hired me as a consultant and said, "Hey, Peter Klein, what kind of machines do you think we should make?" And I say, "Steve, listen, I got this great idea." And I describe the iPad to him. And then Steve says, I don't know about that. Let me think it over. And eventually he decides he will make investments in producing the iPad. Now, he hired me as his consultant. Who is the entrepreneur in that scenario? Yeah, I would argue, and according to Frank Knight, it's not me. Right? I'm the idea man. I had the idea. It was a cool idea. But I didn't invest anything in it. I didn't have any ultimate responsibility for whether it would be done or not. Right? Steve Jobs, he had to decide whether to hire me or not. And once I told him my story, he had to decide whether he agreed with it or not. He had to decide whether to invest or whether to tell me, "Ha ha, great, that's really funny, goodbye." Okay? So, the point I'm making is, according to Knight, being an idea man does not make you an entrepreneur. You have to act on your ideas to be an entrepreneur. Meaning you have to own stuff. You have to own resources. You have to own capital. You have to invest to be an entrepreneur. Okay. The famous Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises described entrepreneurship in much the same way. Mises says in his famous book, Human Action, he says, "The term entrepreneur, as used by economic theory, means acting man exclusively seen from the aspect of the uncertainty inherent in every action." Right? Entrepreneur means acting man from the perspective of the uncertainty that surrounds us, the uncertainty that pervades every decision that we make, including your decision to come to the lecture. Right? Mises goes on talking about the market as a whole. He says, it is impossible to eliminate the entrepreneur from the picture of a market economy. Did you get that? It's impossible to eliminate the entrepreneur. Without an entrepreneur, in the sense of judgmental decision-making under uncertainty, there is no market economy. There is no capitalism. Right? The various complementary factors of production cannot come together spontaneously. They need to be combined by the purposive efforts of men aiming at certain ends and motivated by the urge to improve their state of satisfaction. In eliminating the entrepreneur, one eliminates the driving force of the whole market system. This phrase of Mises, entrepreneurship as the driving force of the market, has often been quoted by other writers. What Mises meant is you need this purposive effort of men, deliberate acting by men and women to bring together factors of production to, in an attempt to make themselves better off. That, according to Mises, is the driving force of the market. So notice you have entrepreneurship, acting man. You have uncertainty bearing, acting man in the face of uncertainty. And you have the ownership and deployment of productive resources to meet those uncertainties. You have the capitalist, right? So the entrepreneur function of bearing uncertainty is manifest in the capitalist function of owning stuff and putting that stuff to use under uncertain conditions. So we have entrepreneurship and capitalism together as the driving force of the market. And that's why I titled my 2010 book, The Capitalist and the Entrepreneur. Not to suggest that capitalists are over here, money lenders, bad guys, and entrepreneurs are over here, creative, dynamic idea men. No, to say that the essence of entrepreneurship, Mises' driving force, consists in bringing these together. Under uncertainty, the capitalist is always an entrepreneur, and the entrepreneur is always a capitalist, meaning someone who takes possession of productive resources and puts them to use. Okay.
May I ask you a question?
Sure.
Well, it means, by your definition, capitalist is the one who has the fund to give to finance a factory or enterprise.
Okay, so the question is I'm sorry, you're saying the capitalist is the person who finances the enterprise. Yes. Sure, but my claim is, if the capitalist, the financier of the enterprise, is what in economics we call the residual claimant, the person who bears ultimate responsibility for deciding how that enterprise will be used, right? Then that financier is exercising the entrepreneurial function of judgmental decision-making under uncertainty. In other words, I might have an idea for an iPad, but I don't have any money. So I go to, if you're going to start up, who do you go to get money?
The bank.
Okay, you might go to the bank. Where else?
Parents.
Parents. Friends. Yeah, there's the old joke that, small startup companies get their funding from the 3 F's. Friends, family, and fools. Okay? If you're more sophisticated, you might go to the venture capital market, right? You might get venture capital from a big venture capital investor. But those people who are lending you the money, they are bearing this residual uncertainty, right? I mean, you bear some uncertainty because if the venture fails, it's bad for your reputation. It makes you feel bad. It might make it harder for you to do something in the future, right? But if you don't have any resources at stake, then your downside exposure, to use finance terminology, is somewhat limited. Okay? One more question, but I want to move on to some applications too. We can have more questions at the end. Okay, we'll have some time for more questions at the end. So, just the story behind these books, this may help you to understand where I'm coming from. My main research areas are the so-called Austrian School of Economics, associated with people like Mises and Hayek. I was particularly influenced by Murray Rothbard, important American representative of the modern Austrian school. And my other research area that in which I was trained was sort of economic theory of the firm, or organizational economics. My thesis advisor was this guy, Oliver Williamson, who was one of the Nobel Prize winners in economics in 2010, thanks to me. Right, so how does the entrepreneur fit in? Well, the entrepreneur is central to Austrian economics. If you read Mises, Kirzner, even some of the older Austrians like Karl Menger, they're always talking about the entrepreneur and how the entrepreneur is at the heart of a market economy, or in Mises' terminology, the driving force of the market economy. However, in modern economics, mainstream so-called neoclassical economics, the entrepreneur doesn't show up very much. And I asked some of the students earlier this week, I bet if you still have your textbooks from introductory economics or intermediate economics, I bet if you go and look through the index, the word entrepreneur will not be found in the index. Most introductory and intermediate level economic theory textbooks do not even mention the entrepreneur, much less discuss, analyze, investigate the role played by the entrepreneur. So one of the things that attracted me to the Austrian school was the central role that it gave to the entrepreneur. So in applying some of these Austrian insights to managerial and organizational problems, right, one gets what I call an entrepreneurial theory of the business firm. An entrepreneurial approach to organization and strategy and economic performance, right? And maybe even a new approach to the firm itself, a new perspective on capitalism itself. Now, what I will talk about before we finish, which won't be too long, is what implications this has for economic policy and for the institutional environment, the background conditions under which business activity takes place. And of course, the main question of the night, which all this is building up to, what then does entrepreneurship do for economic growth? What role does it play in economic growth? Let me briefly address these questions and then we'll have time for some questions at the end. How does public policy affect entrepreneurship? I mean, one way to phrase the research question is to say, okay, how do we encourage productive entrepreneurship while discouraging unproductive or destructive entrepreneurship? Now, what does that mean? Another famous scholar, an economist named Baumol, William Baumol, wrote an influential article on this, arguing that, look, most of you are too young, but some of you aren't. Under Soviet times, did entrepreneurship take place? Yeah, but let's think about it, right? Operating a business in a formal sense, being a capitalist, yeah, that may be a crime. Does that mean no one in the Soviet economy was on the lookout for opportunities to make himself better off? Of course people did that. Does that mean there was no uncertainty? Of course it doesn't. Were people trying to exercise judgment in the face of uncertainty? Of course they were. A lot of this took place on black markets, right? A lot of it took place within the political system, right? I want to get ahead in the party. I want to rise to party chairman and I want to get a high position in the Communist Party. How do I do that? Well, I've got to look for opportunities to influence people. I've got to meet the right people and say the right things and look good in the eyes of the party boss and so forth, right? We often use the term in modern economics, rent-seeking. You may have heard that term in one of your courses. People engage in rent-seeking all the time to try to get stuff for themselves, maybe using the state to get something for them, even though it comes at the expense of everybody else, right? So some kinds of entrepreneurship like that may actually be harmful. That's not making the society better off. That's not creating wealth. It's destroying wealth. Or at the very least, it's redistributing wealth. Right? So how do we prevent that kind of thing from taking place while encouraging entrepreneurship that creates value and makes us all better off? Well, in one of the lectures earlier this week, I discussed with the students kind of a taxonomy of entrepreneurial concepts that I've offered. I call it occupational, structural, and functional. Occupational concepts of entrepreneurship mean those that take the individual worker as the unit of analysis and define entrepreneurship as self-employment. What I call structural concepts are those that take the firm as the unit of analysis and define entrepreneurial as small firms, high-growth firms, young firms, right? By contrast, these general attributes like creativity, initiative, alertness, and judgment, I call those functional approaches to entrepreneurship. Because there, entrepreneurship is sort of an abstract function. It's a way of thinking or acting that is not necessarily manifest in a particular employment category or a particular firm structure. Now, the reason I'm making that point now is because, you know, the answer to this question, how does public policy affect entrepreneurship? Can government get more entrepreneurship? Can government get better entrepreneurship? It kind of depends on what you mean by entrepreneurship. Okay? If you mean self-employment and startups, well, there are a lot of government policies that different countries around the world use to try to get more self-employment and get more startups. So, you know, the tax code could be designed so that, you know, if you're an employee, you pay a certain amount in income tax. I know you guys have a flat tax, is it?
No, we have until some certain level.
Yeah, what's the rate?
0.
Okay, 0, but at a certain point, you pay some tax.
40,000 lari, it's 0.
Okay.
You pay 20%.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but you can imagine the country says, well, you know, wage income we will tax at this rate, but self-employment income we'll tax at a lower rate to encourage more people to migrate into self-employment. You know, there may actually be subsidies, and I don't know if you have those here, where the government just gives money to people to start new businesses. Or it can be more indirect, like, you know, well, you get some kind of exemption from regulation, or maybe you get, maybe the government the government spends money to make the internet faster, or to do something else that is a useful tool for small business, right? So if you want more small businesses, if you want more self-employed people, there are various subsidies and things you can do in the tax code to try to get more of it. Do those things work very well, as an aside? It's not very clear that they do. There is some research on the history, and I know only the case in the US, of government programs designed to get more small business, more self-employment, more inventions, and so forth. Very interesting book by a guy named Josh Lerner. He had a book come out, I think it's last year. It's called Boulevard of Broken Dreams. It's a history of the US Small Business Administration, which is a government entity in the US supposed to encourage more small business. And somebody said, the results are pretty bad, right? It looks like the government policies to try to get more self-employment, more small business, better small business, high growth small business, has not worked well at all.
Fools are the government.
Yeah.
Friends and
Yeah. So, I mean, and you might ask, would we expect the government to be very good at picking which companies are going to be successful and which individuals should get the money? It doesn't seem like it. We would not expect the government to be very good as a venture capitalist. Anyway, if you're interested in this, check out this book by Lerner, where he says that most of these policies have failed, at least in the US. But there's not a whole lot of research on it. Now, by contrast, if we define entrepreneurship in, you know, what I call the functional sense, meaning alertness, innovation, judgment, and so on, well, it's not really obvious what the government can do, except, you know, try to have some kind of good background conditions. What we sometimes call the institutional environment, the rules of the game, like property rights, the rule of law, sound money, and so forth. Let me show you some examples of this. I want to skip. One time I saw, last year I saw a very interesting photo essay on a website, and I discussed this with the students earlier today. These are photographs from the US city of Detroit. Do any of you know what Detroit is famous for? Don't answer if you were in the class earlier today.
Cars.
Yeah, cars. The nickname for Detroit is the Motor City. This is where Henry Ford set up his, you know, the first assembly line. And General Motors, which is, you know, Chevrolet and Pontiac and Buick and so on, and Chrysler and Plymouth, all of the US auto companies were headquartered in Detroit. And for most of the 20th century, Detroit was one of the most important large American cities. But in the last 2 or 3 decades, the American automobile industry fell on hard times. The 70s and 80s, influx of imports from Japan, Toyota and Honda. We never have had very many imports from Europe in the US, only at the high end, you know, Mercedes and BMW, but not for sort of middle class cars. But Japan completely dominated that segment of the market. And the US auto companies have all been through terrible bankruptcies, as you know, and the government bailouts and so forth. As a result, inner city Detroit is now the poorest, one of the poorest areas in the United States. This is a famous old theater in Detroit, UA Theater, which if you can see, I mean, it's all completely run down, it's almost destroyed. But it once was a very beautiful and architecturally famous building. I'll show you some more pictures. This is a famous old hotel in Detroit called the Lee Plaza Hotel. This is the major railway station in Detroit. This is the downtown train station, which is not used at all and is basically a ruin. Here's the inside of the train station, Michigan Central Station. It looks like something from a war zone. And I know that here in Georgia, in the last few decades, you've had some places like this. But you don't expect to find this in America. You don't expect to, you know, it's like going to ancient Greece and looking at the Acropolis. Sorry, it's like going to Greece today and looking at the ruins of the Acropolis, or going to Rome and looking at the Colosseum. Here's a famous ballroom called the Vanity Ballroom, which was once the home of some of the best jazz in America. So famous jazz musicians like Duke Ellington, you may have heard of. Tommy Dorsey was a band leader in the 1930s and 1940s, and they played in this beautiful ballroom, and of course you can look at it now. Now, why am I showing you these pictures? Well, from an entrepreneurial perspective, you might think, hey, these look like undervalued assets. These look like underutilized assets, right? An entrepreneur could buy this building very cheap, right? Fix it up, restore it to its former glory, and you'd have a beautiful, very valuable, expensive ballroom. And I know from talking to some of you earlier that here in Georgia you have the same TV shows, kinds of TV shows that we have at home. One of our popular reality shows it's called Flip This House. People buy old houses, fix them up and sell them. We call it flipping an investment. Flip this house. And I understand you have a show like that in Georgia too. So why isn't anybody doing this? Well, if I were giving this lecture in Detroit, at this point the audience would be laughing hysterically, because nobody would buy property in downtown Detroit. Why? It's like, you know, putting up a beautiful hotel in Kabul or something, I don't know, wherever, some really dangerous place. It's literally like a war zone. There's no property rights at all. There's no police. There's nothing. It's like, you know, there have been some cases where people have tried to renovate some of these buildings, and you know, how do you renovate a building? Where you need materials. You put in new pipes for the water, and you put in wires for the electricity, and the workmen go home for the night, and then come back the next morning, and what happened? It's all gone. It's all stolen. People would rip the pipes out of the walls. They take all the wiring, the lumber, any valuable building materials will be stolen immediately. So you'd have to have your own army or police force, you know, to guard the building. So nobody is buying these undervalued assets and flipping them to make money. It seems like an obvious profit opportunity, but nobody will do it because there's no property rights. There's no property rights here. What's the point? I'm sorry, I'm actually going to skip a couple of slides in the interest of time. I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'll just do it this way. The point is, you need a certain kind of institutional environment for entrepreneurship to take place. You need the rule of law. You need protection for property rights. You need conditions under which exchange can take place. Now, does having those background conditions, does that guarantee that a lot of high-value entrepreneurial activity will take place? No, I don't think it guarantees, right? But in the absence of those background conditions, high-value entrepreneurship is very, very unlikely to take place. Okay, let me just conclude. I'm going to skip to, oh, here we go. So, bottom line, right? Is entrepreneurship key to growth? The reason I said yes and no, on the one hand yes, on the other hand no, is because it depends what you think entrepreneurship means. It depends what you mean by entrepreneurship, right? If we mean something like judgmental decision-making under uncertainty, something that's a fundamental aspect of all human behavior, right? The idea of Mises and others, that capitalist entrepreneurs are the driving force of the market economy. There's a Mises coin that you can buy if you want to invest in Mises. You can buy his coin. It's hard to manipulate, right? It doesn't seem, it's not obvious that you can get more of that with a little bit of intervention, that you can increase or improve that, right? Now clearly, this is fundamental to economic performance because this is the nature of capitalism. Capitalism, by this definition, is entrepreneurial, whether it has a lot of small firms or large firms, okay? Whether it has a lot of startups or whether it has more established companies, okay? But now what if we mean self-employment and new firm formation and so forth? The more conventional mainstream definitions of entrepreneurship. Well, many people think that this kind of business activity is better for a transition economy, for a developing economy, for any economy, than the more traditional kinds of economic development tools. So, like, for example, what my colleagues back home who work on this call smokestack chasing. So they would say that if you're, say in the US, a small town in a rural part of the country that's not very particularly prosperous, how do they improve the standard of living in that small town or that small county or that region? They would say, you need to try to get a big factory. You want to give tax breaks or subsidies or somehow try to lobby for some big company. You want Apple to set up an assembly facility, or you want Ford to put a manufacturing plant in your community that will hire a lot of workers. They'll have more money to spend that will increase the standard of living in that area. Or, more recently, not so much a factory, but maybe something like a giant Walmart distribution center. You guys know what Walmart is? It's the world's largest retailer. It's an American discount store. You want one of their warehouses or whatever, and that will lead to economic growth. But more recently, people who work on economic development have said, that kind of growth is not very sustainable. You know what I mean by sustainable? Permanent, lasting, kind of once it gets started, it will keep going on its own. And part of the reason is, well, the company that sets up the factory, the company that builds the smokestack, they may change their minds and leave. They may take it down. So here in Georgia, people might say, look, we're not trying to attract a lot of big multinationals to set up operations here in Georgia. I mean, yeah, that might be good in the short run, but then they have too much control over us. They may decide to leave, and then we're stuck, right? Rather, if we encourage a lot of Georgians to start their own new businesses, then some of those businesses will grow and prosper, and we'll have our own strong economy. We'll do it ourselves without outside help. It will be, rather than top-down economic development, coming from big multinationals or coming from NGOs or whatever, it will be rather bottom-up. And that's more lasting, more durable, more sustainable. However, the evidence on whether or not this kind of bottom-up development really does contribute to lasting economic growth is not entirely clear. It's not entirely clear. Let me show you sort of two kinds of evidence. One is to say, well, you know, the kind of thing that Muhammad Yunus and Grameen Bank does, you know, microcredit, microenterprise. They've been doing that for about 20 years, 25 years. So people have done some studies, right? What happens to communities where Grameen Bank operates and other banks like it? What happens to those women who get the $20 loan and buy a cow? Do they end up having successful enterprises? Do they grow those enterprises? Do the areas, cities, towns, villages, regions that have a lot of micro-enterprise and microcredit, do they grow? And the evidence so far is pretty disappointing. The empirical evidence suggests that at best, microcredit, microenterprise has maybe a small effect, but in many studies it has no effect, and in some it even seems to have a negative effect. So is that clear how enthusiastic we should be about that kind of entrepreneurship? Now, you guys might say, okay, that's fine, that's Bangladesh, but this is Georgia. We're already a developed economy. We just want to develop a little bit more. Well, there's other kinds of evidence that we could look at. I'll come back to this last point in a minute. Let's look back at history. Right? 1,000 years ago, everybody in the world was poor. Right? But then something happened in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. Some economies began to grow very rapidly. Right? And at first it was Western Europe. The United Kingdom in particular, what we call the Industrial Revolution, right? Factories, smokestacks, a lot of like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, the big railroad tycoons and so forth, claiming that these guys were getting fabulously rich, but maybe at the expense of, the workers and so on. So Western Europe and US went through this kind of a period, large enterprise with huge econ students, economies of scale in production, assembly lines, concentrations of capital and labor. More recently, what about Asia? The so-called Asian economic miracle. After World War II, countries, South Korea, South Vietnam, Thailand, China, and so forth, and Japan even earlier, have had very rapid rates of economic growth. Look at even China just in the last 10 years or so. How did they do it? Well, unfortunately for people like me who are supposed to be advocates of entrepreneurship, it certainly was not the case that Southeast Asia and Japan and China have become wealthy through small business and startups. Okay, but yeah, of course there are small businesses, of course there are startups, but it's mostly been large companies. Large established companies, these big conglomerates, they call them keiretsu in Japan, and chaebol in Korea, big conglomerations with a bank and an auto company and a manufacturing company and a real estate company all tied together. People don't like it. But it's been large enterprise that got us, that got China here, I think this is Shanghai, and with a lot of Asian workers doing this. Now, entrepreneurship scholars and advocates of entrepreneurship say, no, this is bad. We don't want this. We don't want this. We don't want these guys. And we don't want this. But we want this. Maybe it's possible to industrialize, to grow, to go from poverty to wealth, or in the case of a country like Georgia, to go from kind of the middle level to a higher level of performance without large enterprise, without assembly lines, without a lot of people being workers. But nobody else has done it before. It doesn't seem very likely that it's possible to grow solely through self-employment and startups. And a point that I was going to mention on the previous slide too is that, if we think of entrepreneurship in the functional sense, as being the ultimate decision maker about your resources, of controlling your resources, not everybody wants to do that. Not everybody wants to do that. I mean, look, being a worker like this does not seem like very much fun. However, I used this example earlier today. Look at me. I mean, I'm a university professor in the United States. I have a job. I have tenure. I get a salary. I get paid the same amount every month. Not as much as I would like to get paid, but I get the same amount every month. I'm not responsible for taking action that makes sure the university is solvent. Somebody else does that, right? I'm not the residual decision maker. I don't do a lot of judgmental decision making under uncertainty. I'm a wage earner. And you know what? I like it, okay? I like not having that responsibility. I prefer to earn wages or salary than to be self-employed. I mean, I could, right? I could quit, and I could start my own tech company. And of course, I would be just as successful as Steve Jobs and Bill Gates because I'm a genius. I just know that I would be, right? Or I could go to work on Wall Street. I could be an investment banker and make millions and millions and millions of dollars. But I gave that up. I gave it all up, well, mostly because I think being a professor is a lot of fun. I like reading and writing and thinking, and I like dealing with students most of the time. So I'm willing to give up income, not only for the intellectual satisfaction of what I do, but also because I like the steady paycheck. Okay? Likewise, look, every woman in Bangladesh may not want to own her own cow. Some of them might prefer a job like this. Okay? Some people might prefer to work for Apple, or to work for General Motors, or to work for the University of Missouri, rather than run their own firm, be their own boss. Some people like to be their own boss, but not everybody does. And my message is, that's okay. Maybe what we ought to be encouraging is variety. We want a lot of economic freedom where people can start a business or not. They can be self-employed or they can be employees if they prefer. Okay? Rather than trying to force everyone to behave in a particular way. Right? So, bottom line, this is my last slide. Right? Lessons for policy related to entrepreneurship and growth. Don't be a central planner. Okay? Now, I can say that to you guys, a post-Soviet transition economy, and you say, well, duh. But there are a lot of people in the West, there are a lot of American professors who think central planning is a really good idea, and we ought to have more government control of the economy. Like the president. No, I didn't say that. But, look at Silicon Valley, for example. A lot of government officials around the world look at Silicon Valley and they say, that is so great. All those high-tech companies, all that innovation, all that growth. We want that. We want to have Silicon Valley in our country. Right? So maybe somebody right now is saying, well, in Tbilisi, we can have our own technology park. And the next version of Silicon Valley will be right here. We're going to design it and plan it. That's not going to work. Right? Technology clusters like Silicon Valley emerge on their own. They cannot be planned from above. Don't try to pick winners. The government should not pick winners. The government should not try to decide how many people should be self-employed and how many people should be employed. Let the labor market work that out. Okay? The best that policy can do, in my view, is foster an environment that allows people to choose what they want to do, to choose to be workers, to try self-employment if they like, and encourages entrepreneurs to exercise good judgment. So let people appropriate the gains from making good judgments and make them bear the losses for exercising poor judgments. Financial market freedom, labor market freedom, sound money. Don't have high inflation and don't create bubbles and so forth. Don't try to stimulate the economy, as in Keynesian stimulus. And for heaven's sake, do not bail out failing companies. Now, if you want to have some kind of social policy, some kind of, what they call insurance, social insurance, where you help people right? If your company goes bankrupt and you lose your job, if people want to help you in some way, that's fine. But the government should not say, we will not let your company go bankrupt. We will bail out your company. We will make it illegal for your company to shut down. We will make it against the law for your company to lay off workers. That's a bad idea, right? That stymies innovation, discovery, and judgment. It doesn't help it, it hurts it. And, you know, as I said before, protect private property, the rule of law, free and open competition. Thank you very much for your attention. Some other folks had questions. I'm happy to answer a question or two.
I have one.
Yes, please.
About the bailing out of the companies, is it bad for the economy from the whole country, or?
So the question is, I guess, why is it, what's bad about bailing out companies? Yeah, I mean, I think the argument is akin to something that Joseph Schumpeter called, Schumpeter characterized capitalism as a system of creative destruction. Have you heard that term before, creative destruction? What he meant was, there are frequent, you know, there's innovation, right? New companies are started, new products are introduced, but at the same time, what happens to old companies and old products? They go away, they get superseded, right? Famous example is, you know, when the automobile industry, when the automobile was invented and the automobile industry took off, were there any other industries that were hurt?
Yes, railways and trams.
Okay, railways and trams, what else? What did people do before they had automobiles? Horses. Right? What about the horse and, you know, the buggy whip industry? What about people who make shoes, horseshoes? What are the people who make the whips for the horse? Right? They all went bankrupt, most of them. Right? They were clearly harmed in terms of losing their jobs and losing their companies by the introduction of the automobile. Does that mean that it's bad for society that we have the automobile? Of course not. Now, think through this experiment. Suppose the automobile were introduced and the government passed a law saying that no horseshoe makers can lose their jobs. Right? You know, 20% of the population in that, you know, in 1850 was what they call blacksmiths, you know, who make horseshoes. And so by law, it must always be 20%. I mean, right, I mean, that would be a tremendous waste of resources today. I saw a funny thing on Facebook, some of you might have seen this too. It was called Lies My Fourth Grade Teacher Told Me. Some of you may be too young for this, but the older ones. Lies that my grade school teacher told me. And and then the caption was, you have to learn how to do multiplication and division because you won't always have a calculator with you. When I was in school, that's what they, you know, kids always say, why do I have to learn how to do long division? Why can't I just use a calculator? And the teacher would say, well, someday you'll be somewhere where you'll need to know that, and you're not going to carry a calculator with you everywhere you go. Now, back then, a calculator was this big thing, and the Facebook picture, you know, had a smartphone, you know, with the calculator app open. So almost all of you in this room do, in fact, carry a calculator with you everywhere you go, every day. Right? So what if they had passed a law saying that old-fashioned calculators still have to be made in the same quantities and people who build calculators can't lose their jobs? Well, that would represent a bad use of resources.
It's about technological breakthrough. I
mean, she said, is it about technological breakthroughs? I would say a technological breakthrough is one, you know, that's one example, but there could be others too. I mean, look, a lot of people in here have on jeans. Suppose there's just a fashion change. You know, I mean, your great-great-great-grandparents didn't wear blue jeans. Originally, blue jeans were what you'd wear, a farmer would wear them. But people in the city would not, you wouldn't be caught dead in a pair of denim. Right? And then, I guess in the 1950s, and through people like James Dean, all of a sudden it became fashionable to wear blue jeans. Right? What if the fashion changed? What if people stopped wearing blue jeans? Well, we wouldn't want to keep the same amount of investment in the blue jean industry. Right? So what I'm saying is a market economy is very dynamic. there are changes in technology, there are changes in consumers' preferences, changes in the environment, any number of changes, and we want an economy in which, you know, entrepreneurs are able to respond to those changes. And that means that in the short run, people who are making the old product or the old technology are going to have to get a new job. And that's not easy for anybody, I'm not saying that. But for the economy as a whole, it's better if we allow assets to move from one use to another. Labor, capital, resources, allow them to move freely throughout the economy to the areas where they can generate the most economic value. Yes?
So here is a little excerpt from your book, The Capitalist and the Entrepreneur. If the future were known...
A fan.
Okay.
A groupie, we call them.
If the future were known with certainty, man would not act, since his action would not change the future. Can you explain what you mean exactly, because it's confusing for me?
Yeah, this is actually, I don't remember if it's a direct quote, but this is a...
Yes, this is the direct quote.
No, but I mean, in the book, I'm explaining an idea from Ludwig von Mises.
Yeah, okay.
So I don't remember if I was directly quoting him or paraphrasing. But this is an idea from Mises. Mises says if there were no uncertainty, there would be no reason to act. Because action for Mises means, you know, I want to bring about a state of affairs that is different from the one that prevails now. For example, you know, I'm thirsty, right? So I take a drink. That's good. You know, and now I'm not as thirsty anymore, right? Mises says, well, what if this may be a dumb example. You know, what if I knew that no matter how much water I drink, I'll always be just as thirsty, right? What if the future were sort of predetermined so that nothing I do will have any effect on my future well-being? Then I might as well just sit back and let it happen, right? So he means action is always aimed at bringing about some change, and you don't know with certainty whether that will be successful or not. Right? So Mises' argument is the very notion of deliberate, purposeful action implies that I believe my action can make a difference. Therefore, it is not certain that the future will be exactly the way it is today.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, but still, I can make such kind of example. For example, if I know that in a coming summer, the ice cream business will be very profitable. Yes. I have to invest money because of to use this future certainty.
Yes.
And in that way, the potential entrepreneur will start to make action in order to use the future certainty, not to stop his action.
Yeah, so, I mean, let me put it a different way. Mises has actually been criticized on this point by some philosophers who say, you know, well, for example, you guys have the lottery. You have a lottery here, right? Suppose I knew with certainty that I would win the lottery tomorrow. You know, but I have to buy a ticket. It's a silly example, but suppose I knew with certainty that I would win the lottery, no uncertainty at all. Would I act? Of course I would. I would run to the place where you buy the tickets because I know I'm going to win, you know, millions and millions of dollars. But the example that you gave, right, is much more relevant. But, I mean, let's think through that example. You say, well, if I knew with certainty that the price of ice cream next summer is going to be this high, and I can buy milk and sugar and so on at this price, and then I can flip it and earn a bunch of money, well, yeah, then of course I would immediately begin to buy those materials and so on. But think of it this way. I mean, why would I know that without other people knowing that too? Right? If the market as a whole believes that the price of ice cream in the summer is going to be here, what's going to happen to the price of milk and the price of sugar? Right. Already those prices are going to start to rise because lots of people want to do the same thing. Right? And eventually they'll be bid up to the point where you can't make any money in ice cream because you have to pay just, you know, what you pay for the inputs just covers the revenue that you get from the output. I'm sorry, you were going to add something to that. So, yeah, but I think what you should take away, and I don't remember exactly what page that's on or what completely is the context, But Mises is simply saying that uncertainty is, it's embedded in human action. It's not like, well, today there's no uncertainty for me. On Tuesdays and Thursdays I deal with uncertainty, and the other days I don't. No, he means uncertainty is a part of the human condition.